see their investments vanish by the mass production of cannabis, which offered a much cleaner and more economical fuel. Nor should we forget the young pharmaceutical industry, which was financed by two other powerful bankers, John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. These people were conducting an all-out campaign to eliminate the accepted natural herbal treatments, including cannabis, from the pharmacopoeia, while trying to replace them with drugs created in the laboratory. Furthermore, Rockefeller was also the owner of Standard Oil, which had already started to invade America with its refineries and its service stations. Thus was born this natural alliance between the synthetic textile industry, the oil industry, the producers of plastics and its derivatives, and the pharmaceutical industry. They all needed to get rid of the common enemy as soon as possible. Luckily for all, at that time, Andrew Mellon was also the Secretary of the Treasury. From that powerful position, he appointed his future son-in-law, Harry Anslinger, to be the head of the new Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Harry Anslinger had already had experience as a federal agent during Prohibition. His job was now to transform the crumbling bureaucracy of Prohibition, which in the meantime had been abolished, into a new weapon to combat and eradicate cannabis from the future of the nation.
The Treasury Department intends to pursue a relentless warfare against the despicable, dope-peddling vulture who preys on the weakness of his fellow man.
One, however, could not openly attack cannabis, which was a plant loved and respected by the vast majority. Hearst then had the brilliant idea to use the Mexican nickname marijuana, which was totally unknown to Americans at the time. In doing so, on one hand, he managed to divert the suspicions of the true objectives of the operation. On the other, by attaching the use of marijuana to blacks and Mexicans, it made it much easier to ride the growing wave of racism that was already sweeping across the country at the time. Adding fuel to the fire, Anslinger declared that marijuana is mostly used by Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with the Negroes, entertainers, and any others. The backlash was immediate, and soon a new green monster was born. The market was flooded with publications of all kinds in which marijuana, also known as reefer, became synonymous with sin, moral depravity, violence, recklessness, and even murder. From the most popular tabloids to adventure books, from comic strips to sophisticated magazines such as Cosmopolitan, all owned by Randolph Hearst, there was hardly a publication that didn't jump on the bandwagon of demonizing marijuana. Now that Puritan America had found its enemy, Anslinger felt it was time to extend the fear of contagion to the entire population.
America is threatened by a new drug menace. Street corner vendors whose stock in trade is the deadly local weed marijuana pass it out in cigarette form. From ingeniously concealed containers, the reefers go to the waiting hands of deluded youngsters.
Marijuana, the dried leaves and flowers of the Indian hempweed, is used in the form of a cigarette. Marijuana smoking, experts point out, can make a helpless addict of its victim within weeks, causing physical and moral ruin and death. Let's go, Jack. I'm red hot.
Every reefer is loaded with immorality and bestial perversion, brutality, murder, sex crimes, insanity, or suicide.
Should you ever be confronted with the temptation of taking that first puff of a marijuana cigarette, don't do it.
At the end of this devastatingly effective media campaign, a bill was introduced in Congress that in fact prohibited the cultivation and use of marijuana. Even though its psychotropic compounds are found only in the flower and leaf of cannabis, Anslinger was able to have the entire cultivation of the plant prohibited all across the country. Most of the representatives and senators who voted on the bill, in fact, didn't even know that cannabis and marijuana were the same thing.
At that time, congressmen voting on this piece of legislation were not aware that marijuana was hemp, cannabis hemp, that that country had been using profitably for centuries.
Without public debate and without the support of scientific research, in 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was approved by President Roosevelt.
Ladies crave the country's rave.
The war on cannabis had officially begun. There were dozens of glamorous arrests, which the same Hearst immediately made known to the entire nation. But not everyone believed in the demonic dangers of marijuana. The popular mayor of New York City, Marijuana-Logues, commissioned a scientific investigation to ascertain the real effects of marijuana on the user. 31 independent scientists worked for over 5 years, completing what became the first known scientific study on the use of marijuana. Published in 1944, the LaGuardia report showed surprising results. Marijuana, it said, does not cause aggressive or antisocial behavior, does not cause an increase in sexual depravity, does not alter the fundamental aspects of personality. Furious, Anslinger immediately resorted to the press to discredit the research, then unleashed his agents all over the country with the task of destroying every copy of the report they could find. Still not satisfied, Anslinger steered the media propaganda so that the casual smoker of marijuana became associated with the users of hard drugs such as heroin, cocaine, or morphine.
It is a symbol of narcotic addiction, is poisoning the blood of our country. But it occurs when the addict is deprived of his narcotic. He is experiencing withdrawal symptoms. He lives from fix to fix. The addict must have his drug, and to get it he must have money, and that much money comes hard. Marijuana is also smoked. Marijuana is the most prevalent narcotic among juveniles. Its greatest danger lies in the fact that it is a stepping stone to the harder drugs such as morphine and heroin. 95% of narcotic addicts begin with the use of marijuana.
Based on this myth, which has never been confirmed by scientific research, the marijuana user was equated with the figure of the pathetic drug addict, the social reject, the loser who no longer had a chance of recovery. Building on this misinformation campaign, Anslinger convinced Congress to enact new laws which provided that the smoker of marijuana would suffer the same penalties as that of hard drug users such as cocaine or heroin. In 1956, the first arrest for possession of marijuana carried a mandatory sentence of 2 to 10 years in prison. In some states like Missouri, a second arrest for marijuana possession could be punished with life behind bars. Now that America was under control, Anslinger turned his attention to the rest of the world, where cannabis was still being cultivated freely. At the United Nations, Anslinger began knitting a Machiavellian web of diplomacy based on the growing power the United States could now exert over other nations. In 1961, Anslinger culminated his career by persuading the UN to unify all single existing treaties on drug control. Thus was born the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, to which more than 150 countries adhered. The convention established an international tribunal for the control of drugs and committed individual states, among other things, to combat and eradicate as soon as possible the cultivation of cannabis. Within a few years, the production of cannabis would become illegal virtually everywhere in the world. The petrochemical industry had won its battle, while the world received in exchange the huge ecological disaster we are witnessing today: air pollution, the contamination of aquifers, rivers, and the seabed, wild deforestation, extinction of animal species, global warming, and most importantly, our slavery to oil, which could be erased at any time by simply going back to cannabis as the basis for all fuel production.
100 years ago, the farmer produced all of the fiber, all of the medicine, all of the fuel, and all of the food that the society consumed. That's what farming is. You raise those 4 basic categories: fiber, food, medicine, and fuel, and you sell them in the cities as the basic necessities of life. land is a means of production of wealth. It's been that way for thousands of years. Today, 100 years later, the farmer doesn't produce any fiber. If they do, it's cotton, which accounts for 50% of the pesticides and herbicides used in the agricultural sector. The farmer doesn't raise any medicine. It's all been monopolized by the pharmaceutical companies. The farmer doesn't raise any fuel. It's all been monopolized by the petrochemical companies. And if you go into a grocery store and look at the ingredients on package, you'll find out how rapidly the farmer is being displaced from their heritage of food production. It's all been taken over by the synthetic manufacturers who, in producing these synthetic products, create the toxic waste and the hazardous byproducts with which we're having such a tough time dealing. And not only that, it concentrates wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people all the time, because the means of production of wealth is no longer the land. It is now the factories and the shareholders and the people who own the controlling interest in those corporations.
But there are other reasons not to smoke marijuana. The irony is that the United States used the fact of having imposed on the rest of the world the severe prohibition on cannabis to justify its increasingly harsh laws at home against its own marijuana users. Nearly every country in the world, including the United States, is a signatory to an international law banning the use, sale, cultivation, and possession of dangerous drugs such as heroin and marijuana. Despite this prohibition, however, the number of marijuana smokers kept growing, especially among the young. With the hippie revolution, towards the end of the 1960s, marijuana came into the open, and the joint became the symbol of social rebellion and an affirmation of individual rights. Confused, people wanted to know more. Faced with masses of youth who preached only peace and love, it was becoming more and more difficult to see the awful, bloodthirsty criminals described in the simple-minded propaganda of earlier decades. New scientific research was undertaken in Palo Alto, California to better clarify the actual effects of marijuana on the individual. The conclusions were anything but terrifying.
Well, Bill, it's been about 2 hours since you got the drug. How do you feel?
Fantastic. Defiant? Not at all. Business-like? Not at all. Sheesh. Friendly. Extreme.
Would you be interested in taking part in a study like this again and having the same type of drug?
Sure.
You would. It's been a very pleasant experience for you.
I'll do it anytime you want.
We don't smoke marijuana.
In the meantime, Vietnam soldiers were discovering marijuana.
Well, it's all a shotgun. What we basically use it for on the LZ, and I guess even out in the field, so if you want to know. They said we use it the shotgun. Paul, they brought up both of them. This is probably all SIDS and we're getting busted, but I don't care.
And here, too, it became clear that cannabis did not increase one's aggressiveness. Quite the contrary.
You get really stoned. Then, who cares about the war? This war.
Many Hollywood stars also began to openly support the legalization of marijuana.
Often have you smoked, Paul?
Oh, sure. 2 martinis will knock me flat. Pot, I just sort of sit around, Imagine it's a big subject. Of course, marijuana, in my opinion, should be legalized. First of all, you'd have wall-to-wall prisons if you really meant that everybody who smoked it had to go to jail. So, how can you possibly enforce the law, for God's sake?
Yeah.
Be trampling over bodies to get to the next cigarette.
This sudden wave of freedom deeply worried the right-wing conservatives.
I think this is the time and this is the place to take off the gloves and sock it to them.
In 1968, Richard Nixon ran and won on the promise of restoring tranquility and moral order in a country torn apart by social revolution. Among the first things he had to face was the large popular movement asking for the decriminalization of marijuana. To buy time, Nixon ordered a new commission to study the effects of marijuana on the individual.
I wonder if you could give us some of your thoughts on it.
Mr. Point, as you know, there is a commission that is supposed to make recommendations to me about this subject.
But once again, the results were quite opposite to what he expected.
The recommendation of the
Commission in its first report is that we do not feel that private use or private possession in one's own home should have the stigma of criminalization, that people who experiment should not be criminalized for that particular behavior.
Richard Bonney was co-chair of that commission.
It became apparent how little was really known about the effects of this drug and how little evidence there was to support the claims about its dangers.
When Nixon was informed of the results, he trashed the report without even reading it. He then went on television to let the country know that the draconian laws on marijuana would not change.
I shall continue to oppose efforts to legalize marijuana.
Then Nixon had a law on controlled substances approved, which placed marijuana in so-called Schedule I, together with more heavy and dangerous drugs, like heroin and morphine, which have, quote, no medical use.
The federal government, by classifying marijuana in Schedule I, is saying that it has no medical uses, which is a bald-faced lie because it has 10,000 years in every culture of medical use.
DEA Administrative Judge Francis Young ordered a study on the therapeutic validity of marijuana and concluded that its placing in Schedule I was unreasonable, arbitrary, and capricious.
He came up with a 60-odd page opinion saying marijuana is probably the safest drug in the pharmacopoeia, and it certainly has medical utility, and it should be moved to Schedule II.
At around the same time, England ordered a similar study by Baroness Wotton, a well-known sociologist and criminologist who had collaborated with the British government before. The results were similar to those of the Nixon Commission. The long-term consumption of cannabis in moderate doses, said the report, has no harmful effects. There is no evidence that this activity is causing violent crime or aggression, antisocial behavior, or is producing in otherwise normal people conditions of dependence or psychosis requiring medical treatment. The study concluded that possession of a small amount of cannabis should not normally be regarded as a serious crime to be punished by imprisonment. But there was nothing that could apparently change Nixon's mind. In fact, to better implement his new laws, Nixon created the powerful DEA, the federal agency tasked with fighting the traffic and use of drugs all over the nation. Thanks to their special status, DEA agents could spy on private citizens and could break into their houses without a warrant. Thus, the DEA became also a tool to control blacks and other minorities and all those who had political positions disliked by the White House. But the spread of marijuana appeared to be unstoppable, and towards the mid-70s it had already reached the first strata of American suburbia. Now the user was not only the dropout hippie, the penniless artist, or the long-haired student, but also the corporate lawyer, the bank manager, or the grandmother of that student.
I spent a lot of time with my daughter and her friends, and they all smoked marijuana, and so I had to try it.
Passionate activist groups were being born all across America, demanding the decriminalization of marijuana.
We don't want any penalty for the private possession and use and cultivation of marijuana.
In the first of its kind, Oregon State in 1973 challenged the federal law and proceeded to decriminalize the personal use of marijuana. 10 more states would follow within a few years. In the meantime, Richard Nixon, defeated by his own moral issues, retired from the stage. In a twist of direction that seemed to better reflect the changes in society, Democrat Jimmy Carter, elected in 1976, took an open stand in favor of decriminalization.
President Carter proposes major changes to federal drug laws.
I support a change in law to end federal criminal penalties for possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana, leaving the states free to adopt whatever laws they wish concerning marijuana.
But in the short 4 years he had in office, he was able to get very little done. The return to the White House of the Republicans with Ronald Reagan meant a new tightening in the war on marijuana.
Leading medical researchers are coming to the conclusion that marijuana, pot, grass, whatever you want to call it, is probably the most dangerous drug in the United States, and we haven't begun to find out all of the ill effects. But they are permanent ill effects.
No one, however, has ever been able to find those alleged studies which would show devastating effects on the marijuana user. pharmaceutical companies are very threatened by the idea of people having direct access to substances that really work. And so there is a lot of effort to scare people away from natural medicines by telling them that they're dangerous, that things out of nature are more dangerous for you than the products of pharmaceutical companies. With the full support of the White House, the DEA now had available the most modern technology for controlling and terrorizing its citizens. It soon became a feared apparatus of state repression. Thousands of young Americans ended up in prison every day just for possession of a single reefer. Innocent young people saw their personal records stained forever for a simple arrest.
Read my lips.
The presidency of George H. Bush, former CIA director and Reagan's successor, made the repressive measures against marijuana users even tougher.
Our nation has zero tolerance for casual drug use. If you use drugs, you will be caught. And when you're caught, you will be punished. Some think there won't be room for them in jail. We'll make room. The rules have changed.
Once the Democratic Bill Clinton was elected, everyone expected a softening stance on the repression of marijuana users and a return to a more balanced position. To everyone's surprise, Clinton instead relaunched the war on drugs on a global scale.
Drugs are every nation's problem, and every nation must act to fight them. We are determined to build the drug-free America and to join with others to combat drugs around the world.
In the meantime, his Secretary of Justice, Janet Reno, went as far as to openly threaten doctors who wished to prescribe marijuana for medical use.
We want to make clear that federal law still applies, and federal officials will continue to apply the law, and DEA officials will review cases, as they have, to determine whether to revoke the registration of any physician who recommends or prescribes so-called Schedule I controlled substances.
While systematically ignoring the results of all the new medical studies, Clinton officials kept propagating the false information, which has never found support in scientific studies on the alleged dangers of marijuana.
All available research has concluded that marijuana is dangerous to our health.
By the end of his mandate, Clinton had become the president who spent more than anyone else in the history of the United States to fight the war on drugs. With the presidency of George W. Bush, the situation remained pretty much the same, and only the election of Barack Obama seemed to bring in a new sense of change.
Federal law, of course, still considers it a controlled substance, and there have been attempts from Washington to punish doctors.
Yeah, I would not punish doctors if it's prescribed in a way that is appropriate. That may require some changes in federal law. I will tell you that what I'm not going to be doing. What I'm not going to be doing is using Justice Department resources to try to circumvent state laws on this issue, simply because I want folks to be investigating violent crimes and potential terrorism. We've got a lot of things for our law enforcement officers to deal with.
But when in 2010 California was about to vote on Proposition 19, the song from Washington regressed back to its old tune.
Top prosecutor is now reminding folks that pot will still be illegal under federal law. The Attorney General Eric Holder warns the U.S. government will continue to enforce the law even if voters in California pass Prop 19.
Proposition 19 did not pass. Therefore, the conflict between the federal and state laws remains at this point unresolved. Quite different is the attitude by some European countries, where the law enforcement has instead concentrated on cutting down illegal drug trafficking, while the user is no longer treated as a criminal. The most famous example is certainly the Netherlands, where personal possession and consumption of marijuana has been decriminalized for many years. Contrary to what many feared, marijuana use has not increased significantly in this country, while the number of crimes connected to illegal drugs has declined drastically. In Amsterdam today, any adult can walk into one of the so-called coffee shops and purchase a limited quantity of grass for personal use without having to fear being arrested. Millions of dollars are saved by not having to continuously send to prison thousands of individual users, while the same money can be used to pursue much more efficiently the criminal trafficking of heavier and more dangerous drugs, such as cocaine and heroin. But the most advanced and possibly shocking example comes from Portugal, which in 2001 chose to decriminalize the possession and use of all kinds of drugs, from marijuana to heroin, from cocaine to amphetamines.
8 years ago in Portugal, the law was changed so that possessing or using any illicit drug was no longer a crime. At the time, there were warnings the policy would be disastrous and that the country would become a European haven for drugs tourism.
But what one politician at the time called the promise of sun, beaches and any drug you like simply didn't materialise. In fact, since decriminalisation, the consumption of drugs here in Portugal has gone down.
Portuguese drug squad stresses they're not going soft on the traffickers. Seizures have more than doubled since 1995. Police say earlier fears that Portugal would be awash with drugs following decriminalisation have proved unfounded.
We felt, and the Portuguese police forces were worried, that there would be an increase in consumption after its decriminalisation. This did not happen.
Local police believe things are getting better.
If we were to hang around here for a while, we would see some drug taking, but not as much as a year ago.
When users are caught, they receive a summons from the police ordering them to attend a special drugs commission run by the health service. Nothing to do with the court system at all. From there, they're offered treatment and support.
We try to dissuade people to do drugs. We don't forbid them, but we try to inform them about the risks that they are taking while they are doing drugs.
The idea that users need care, not punishment, has swept across Europe. 10 countries in the EU generally don't pursue possession as a crime.
Portugal's current Prime Minister was one of the chief architects of the policy change and says what his country has done can be exported internationally.
I think the strategy can work in any country. You just need to rid yourselves of prejudice and take an intelligent approach.
Many countries are currently considering some sort of decriminalization, and the situation remains fluid throughout the world. But the factor that has the highest potential to radically change the future of cannabis is certainly the enormous progress made in the scientific circles on marijuana's medical properties. The fact that marijuana is an effective treatment for hundreds of different diseases has been known for centuries. It is often considered a miracle drug, but now we are beginning to understand why. The medicinal qualities of cannabis have been known since ancient times. Emperor Shen Nun, the founder of Chinese medicine, prescribed marijuana for rheumatism and malaria. His soldiers used cannabis leaves to heal their wounds because of its antibacterial properties. In the Indian subcontinent, cannabis has always been used in Ayurvedic medicine for epilepsy, gastritis, anorexia, bronchitis, leprosy, spleen problems, diabetes, and asthma. In the beginning of the 19th century, doctors returning from Asia imported the use of medical cannabis to the West, where they used it to alleviate the symptoms of typhus, tetanus, and other infections. Queen Victoria regularly used marijuana to alleviate her menstrual pains. Her personal physician declared that, managed properly, cannabis is one of the most valuable medicines. At the end of the 19th century, over 30% of drugs available in America contained cannabis.